Welcome to this Exam Insights session focused on student performance in the Summer 2024 Lower Secondary Global Citizenship exam. This training is for teachers of the qualification, and it will focus on the performance of some key questions in last summer's series. By the end of this session, you will have received feedback on the performance of candidates. We will have looked at variations in performance, examples of where some students did very well answering some difficult questions, but also looking at areas where there is room for improvement and where clearly some students could be helped to do even better in future years. We'll be amplifying and addressing some of the key points from the examiner's report and hoping to give teachers greater confidence in delivering this specification effectively. The session is in two parts. The first, much shorter part, offers a brief review of the topics, the exam structure, question types, command terms, mark scheme requirements, and assessment objectives that are used for this test. The second, longer part of the presentation looks at different question types, multiple choice questions, 2-mark items, 4-mark items, and the final 6-mark question on the exam. We look at the design of each of these types of question and reflect on examples of higher and lower scoring examples of student work for each type of question. Moving on then to part 1, a brief overview of the topics and exam structure, to look at some of the important features of the assessment that will affect how students perform. Here's a brief reminder of all of the topics that students study as part of this course. They link together as shown by the arrows. Many of these issues and themes become interrelated. Social justice, identity, diversity, globalization, interdependence, peace and conflict, human rights, power, governance, and ultimately sustainable development. All of these are part of global citizenship. The assessment model draws on all of these themes to create 4 different sections in the exam that focus on different aspects of being a citizen. We move from the individual, myself, to my community, to my country, and finally to myself as a global citizen. Section A is mainly comprised of multiple choice questions and has 16 marks available. There are then 64 marks spread over the other sections in a combination of 1, 2, 4 and 6 mark items. The last of these, the 6-mark question, is a particularly important showcase for students to show they're beginning to develop the extended writing and evaluative skills that will help them progress towards and succeed in international GCSEs or equivalent qualifications. In line with the IGCSE course, there are assessment objectives underlying the design of this course. It's important that students understand that the test will do more than check that they've revised and learnt by heart long lists of facts, information or terms. We also want to check that they can use information, that they can do things with the knowledge they have gained. They need to apply information. This is AO2, Assessment Objective 2. Can they apply the knowledge they've learned to answer some more challenging questions? And can they interpret and evaluate information? Can they weigh up different viewpoints and begin to form a judgment? This is a very important skill, and this is tested as part of Assessment Objective 3. Note that overall AO2 and AO3 do constitute 55% of the exam, just over half the marks available. So clearly this is an examination that does go beyond simple recall of information. Students are being prepared to apply information they've learned to new contexts and source material. For example, a suggested scenario where injustice or an abuse of power is happening. What would they do? What advice could they give? There were questions like that on this year's paper. I've mentioned the 6-mark question a couple of times now, and it is a very important and unique feature of this qualification. Students every year will be presented with a provocative statement and asked to discuss how far do you agree with this statement. They need to read that question carefully and produce a focused answer that can look for points that both support and contradict the statement. They argue for and against, and eventually come up with their own conclusion. We move into part 2 of the presentation, reviewing marked scripts, examples of students' work from the 2024 exam, where we can reflect on the things that students did well and some of the areas where there's room for improvement. This section is broken down according to the type of question: multiple choice questions or 2-mark questions, 4-mark questions. So we'll start off by looking at some of the multiple choice questions that appeared in section A. This is question 5. It was a recall question asking students a straightforward question about which United Nations body exists to resolve conflict, the key being D, the Security Council. Around half of students couldn't answer this question correctly, but the UN's role in conflict resolution is an important idea in the specification. This is, referring to what I said earlier, an assessment objective 1 question. It's directly testing recall of a topic. Students who have revised and put the hours in are likely to do very well in these types of question. Here is another example of a recall question. Which of these people defended human rights in South Africa? C. Nelson Mandela. Around 3/4 of students answered this question correctly. Clearly, Nelson Mandela's work was well known. Human rights defenders are the teaching focus of section 5.4. This is also an assessment objective 1 question. It directly tests students' knowledge of a topic. In contrast, this is a slightly different question formulation. It's what's called an AO2 question, where students are applying their knowledge. The question says, which of the following is a possible environmental cause of migration? This requires that students pause and think about what the word environmental means, and then work out which of the causes of migration they have learnt applies best to the statement. Now, around half of all students couldn't answer this question correctly, suggesting that they were not as well prepared as they might have been to stop and think about certain types of question before answering. That's because this is assessment objective 2. Students remember what environmental means, think carefully about which is the best answer, and then make their choice. They're applying knowledge to a context. So, a large number of students chose conflict or discrimination or poverty instead of the correct answer, drought. A quick summary then of some of the strengths and weaknesses of student multiple choice performance that we can usefully take and apply to next year's teaching. Students need to avoid knowledge gaps. This is really important. A significant number of the multiple choice questions will be asking them in very straightforward ways to tell us what they've learned. The glossary in Appendix 1 of the specification is a very good starting point for revision. Students are advised to keep a glossary or a list of key terms that could turn up in these kinds of questions. They also need to think carefully when they're asked to apply their knowledge and understanding. They shouldn't rush these questions, and it's important to pause and underline key words, such as environmental, in the question we just reviewed. They need to read the instructions carefully. And finally, it's worth ticking every box, even when you don't quite know what the answer is, because there is a 1 in 4 chance you will get that mark. We'll look now at 2-mark written answers. These appear throughout sections B, C and D. There are 2 different types of question construction that are used in the exam. One is testing breadth of knowledge, the other is testing depth. The first item here, state 2 ways a community can benefit from refugees joining it. This is testing breadth. It's checking that students can tell us more than one way. In that sense, it is an AO1 recall question of a topic. How have people benefited from the experience of refugees? And in this case, 2 simple statements are required for the award of the marks. In contrast, the other item, there are 2 marks available for an answer that explains in a little more depth what is meant by sustainable development. The 4 lines here are to be filled up with a more developed explanation of sustainable development. Students might think that 2 sentences should be written here. That would be a good idea. So the depth of knowledge is there, and the second mark is reserved for greater depth of explanation or understanding of a key citizenship idea. We'll look in a bit more detail at the approach to answering these types of questions, along with examples of student writing. Here's that question again. State 2 ways a community can benefit from refugees joining it. And notice the focus here is very specific. How is the community benefiting from the refugees it's helped becoming part? This is the mark scheme that was used. The answers that are suggested are the kind of things it was hoped students might explore as part of their response. You can see examples there, such as the idea that a refugee could be a doctor or a teacher who can then make an important contribution to the community they've joined. We also credit a positive view of the arrival of people from different cultures and the idea that it can be enriching for people from a different culture to join you, that they may bring new types of food or music or fashion. This has been the experience throughout the world over time of migration and cultural change. So these ideas would be marked positively too. The idea that a community could benefit if the refugees bring and share parts of their culture that other people will find interesting. Only a third of students scored 2 marks here. The remainder scored 1 or 0. This showed either that they struggled to think of a second way or that they misunderstood the question. The question was asking them what the benefits to the community would be, and unfortunately many misread the question. They rushed, they didn't read carefully, and they wrote about the benefits the refugees would get from being helped, which is a different question. As we move through examples of student writing, I'll invite you to pause the film, read the answers, decide what marks you would give them, and then press play when you're ready to hear what the real marks were. So please now pause the film, think what your marks are, and then press play when you're ready. This answer was awarded 1 mark. The first statement did not gain credit. The idea that more people is a benefit is not necessarily correct. In some contexts and some places, large numbers of people arriving can create challenges as well as benefits. So we would have wanted the student to state a specific benefit other than just more people. The second idea, in contrast, was awarded a mark. It does appear on our marking scheme, the idea of sharing of culture, seen in a positive way. The refugee could teach them about some of the beliefs or traditions that they have. This positive idea was given 1 mark. The other response is one of the best that was seen in last summer's exam. I'm sure you'll agree it's a very good answer, extremely specific. Some refugees could have been doctors or engineers in their previous life, and they'll now contribute to the community. Very well expressed and specific answer. We also credit the idea that there is now an opportunity for different cultures to interact, a positive global citizenship idea. So overall, this was given 2 marks. Here's another example of a 2-mark question that is testing breadth of knowledge by asking students to do 2 different things, each of which will be awarded 1 mark. In this case, they were invited to define economic migrant and to define asylum seeker. These are 2 key ideas that appear within their course. Here's the mark scheme. All that was required was a simple statement about what an economic migrant is. Someone who chooses to leave home seeking a better job, better employment, a better standard of living. whereas an asylum seeker is someone who is fleeing persecution or conflict, looking for shelter, who's been forced to leave their home. These are the sorts of insights we're looking for in a good answer. Less than 1/3 of students gained both marks. A mark of 0 was actually more typical, suggesting that many students were not very familiar with the topic of migration. Again, I invite you to now read through these student responses and decide what marks you'd give. Pause the film while you're doing this, and when you're ready, press play and I'll reveal the real marks. This answer did not gain any credit, unfortunately. The first statement doesn't actually tell us anything that isn't already there in the question. We said, what is an economic migrant? And they said it's a person who leaves for economic reasons. We needed them to show they understood what economic means, such as job or employment, quality of life. Also, they didn't tell us anything about the leaving, that it's a voluntary movement. So if they'd either developed the leaving or the word economic, they could have had the mark. The second statement shows this student, unfortunately, did not know what an asylum seeker is. A person who cares about the world and its problems. This shows a fundamental misunderstanding of the term. In contrast, this answer gains 2 marks. An economic migrant is someone who moves from one place to another looking for jobs. Clearly, that gets the mark, the idea that economic is linked with jobs. And an asylum seeker is someone who's left their home because of persecution and is looking for safety in another country. That's an excellent, well understood definition of the term. We will look now at the other type of 2-mark question, where a development mark is being looked for. There are 2 marks available, one for a simple statement and the other for some further explanation or development. Here's the mark grid that was used. Explain what is meant by sustainable development. A totally correct definition is shown in the first paragraph. It's development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. This would automatically gain 2 mark. Any idea which takes the idea that what we do in the present, economically or environmentally, should be thinking about the needs of people in the future as well. That is the correct definition of the term. But there are many other ways of gaining the marks, where there is a valid starting point and then a valid development. And another example is shown there, where everyone has a sustainable lifestyle, and that means that everyone would have a fair share of resources. This type of approach as well would also gain full credit. Only a quarter of candidates scored 2 marks though. Around half scored no marks. This showed that there was a lack of familiarity with a key concept for global citizenship and the idea that underpins the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So read these 2 examples here and decide what marks you would give them. Pause while you're doing that, and when you're ready, press play and I'll reveal the real marks. This answer gained 1 mark. It's quite a tricky item to mark. The student begins by saying it's about keeping the environment safe and not hunting animal habitats. We felt there is a mark available there for the idea of looking after the environment in the present. It's not really talking about development, but more about protection of biodiversity. So there is just 1 mark there. The second statement is it's using a different type of transport. This is a second stated idea, but it doesn't develop our understanding of the first idea. What we needed them to say was that this would then keep the environment safe for people in the future. In contrast, this answer does gain both marks. It shows proper understanding of the concept. It's an approach to growth in the present that doesn't compromise the future needs, the future generations. The English grammar is not perfect here, but this isn't a spelling and grammar test. It's a citizenship test that looks to see if students have the understanding they need of important ideas and concepts. And so long as that shows, we award the marks. Here's one more example of a 2-mark item that asked students to give us a developed explanation. We asked them what is meant by climate change. 2 marks, 4 lines. Here's the marking scheme. 1 mark for a simple statement and the second for some development or explanation or relevant example. These would be examples of good answers: that climate change is global warming, which is an ongoing increase in global temperatures. Here, the key idea, the developed explanation is it's something ongoing. It's something quite worrying and large scale that is continuing. There's another example of a possible answer there, that it's a historic change in temperatures and it shouldn't be confused with short-term weather. That would also give us an understanding that the student knows that this is a long-term, permanent change in the climate. Only a quarter of candidates scored 2 marks. Around half scored 0 marks, which was surprising. Climate change is a very important and ongoing concern for global citizenship. Here are 2 student answers. Pause the film, decide on your marks, and press play when you're ready for me to tell you the real marks. This was awarded 1 mark. It's a change to the temperature or climate. If the word temperature wasn't there, this would gain no marks, because saying that climate change is a change in the climate is not a good answer. But the idea that it's something affecting temperatures, we saw in the mark scheme that we would have given a mark for a statement that it is global warming. A view was taken that this is the minimum needed to trigger the first mark. It's a change in temperature. But we need there to be some development that shows this isn't just everyday weather, that this is something ongoing, long-term or permanent. And the other answer, in contrast, does do this. It says that climate change is a change in the weather, which gets a mark, but it also recognises that it is a long-term shift. So if you were marking this with a pen, you'd put a tick on long-term shift and another tick on weather. It's unusual to see a student score quite so well by just writing 1 line. This is a very concise and well-written short piece of writing. In summary, here are some key pieces of advice for students in the future when they approach the 2-mark questions. They've got to read the question carefully. Are they recalling the meaning of a key term or applying their own knowledge and understanding to a new context? To help them, have they underlined, understood, and paid attention to key details of the question? A very good example to go over with students is the item we looked at a moment ago, which asked what benefits a community gains from helping refugees, rather than benefits for refugees themselves. Students would be advised to look at that question and realise how carefully they needed to think about it before answering it. Have they paid attention to the number of marks? If there are 2 marks available for a single explanation, they must realise that short sentences are less likely to gain the 2 marks than a fuller answer. The general instruction here is to fill the lines, make sure you've written a thorough answer. And as they do so, try to make use of citizenship ideas, concepts and issues. Try to include key words or details. Think of the student who mentioned teachers and doctors when they said, refugees, asylum seekers might have skills that they bring. It's important to give us evidence and detailed answers that give the student an expert voice. Move on now to explore approaches to answering 4-mark questions. These are more challenging for students because they now have to show both depth and breadth of knowledge. In some cases where we would ask them to explain 2 ways, 2 impacts, 2 challenges, 2 benefits. That kind of question formation with 4 marks attached and 2 4-line answer spaces for them to fill. In both cases, they have got to produce a starter idea and then develop it for the award of full marks. Here's the mark scheme for that question. Each way in which sustainable living is encouraged, there is 1 mark available for a creditable idea and then a further mark for some development or explanation. You can see suggested answers there: turning the lights off when not needed, which would reduce the waste of energy, or closing windows, which would keep rooms warmer without using up energy. Those types of ideas. It is important that this is something credible that the student could do in their school or community. We haven't asked for businesses, governments or international agency. This is focused on the student encouraging sustainable living in their own community. Have a read through this first answer, decide what marks you'd award. Press pause now and press play when you're ready for me to show the answer that was awarded. This received the full 4 marks. The first response tells us that instead of cutting down trees to use as firewood, we should move towards the use of energy-saving stoves instead. That's fine, it's a developed answer. Or we should prevent burning plastics and change to recycling because that would reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In that second example, it's almost the wrong way around. The development comes after the action, but we look at it as a whole and go, of course, there are 2 marks there. This was awarded the full 4 marks. Both answers contain a specific, realistic action that a student could take or a student's family could take within a community, and there is a development to explain how they are more sustainable. We're told that to use an energy-saving stove would retain energy and would mean we don't have to cut down trees to use as firewood. That's fine. And we're also told that greater recycling and less burning of plastics would reduce the amount of carbon dioxide released to the atmosphere. So that is a strong answer that receives the full 4 marks. Now read this second one, pause and press play when you've decided your own mark and you can compare it with the one that was actually awarded. This gained 2 marks. In both cases, a simple action is stated, but there is no development of the kind we might expect when 4 marks are available. Advise people to ride bicycles, which are sustainable. That's really just repeating the question, saying they are sustainable. We need you to explain why they are sustainable. Perhaps the student might have said, rather than driving cars, which contribute to global warming. Advise people to plant trees when they're cutting trees, the idea of afforestation, cut a tree, plant a tree, but again, there is no development here. For example, the student might have said, this helps to store carbon and reduce global warming. Here's a second example of a 4-mark question broken into 2 answers, each of which could receive 2 marks, 2 plus 2. This provides an interesting context for students to apply their knowledge to. You can clearly see that this is an AO2 applied understanding question. Students are told lessons in school will start an hour earlier next term. State and explain 2 reasons why some students might think this is unfair. There's a key concept of unfairness here, and what examiners were looking for was a statement of a problem that this might cause for some students and a development that would show understanding of what unfair means. I particularly like the way that some of the answers here recognise that because some children live a long way from school, they could be travelling in the dark, which is dangerous. Or some children have to get up early. This means they're tired when arriving at lessons. And implied Within these answers is the idea that only some children are affected by this, which makes it intrinsically unfair. The most common modal mark was 2 out of 4. This does tell us that students perhaps lacked an understanding of just how much they needed to say in order to gain the full marks. The question is focused on the concept of fairness. It's a key idea linked with social justice. We're looking for them to develop an idea that shows unfair outcomes for some students. Now let's take a look at some examples of students writing. Pause and press play when you're ready for me to tell you what the mark is. This received 2 marks. There are 2 stated problems. Some students feel that they're being overworked. Some students might feel tired. But these are very short statements that don't really explain in any way the nature of these problems and how they could be seen as being unfair. It would be good if they might have developed the idea that the students who live furthest away from school might be worst affected or worse affected than others, which would convey a sense that it's unfair. Now pause, read this, think what mark you would give it, press play when you're ready for me to tell you the real mark. This gained 4 marks. It's a wonderful example of good writing by a student who's really thought about what the question means. The first answer tells us some children won't get there in time because they live far away, which is fine for a mark, the idea that some children will be late, but it develops this to say that this is particularly true for the children who travel on foot, unlike those who come to school in a car. So within this answer we have a framing of the problem to show that some children are worse affected than others by this issue because they don't have access to a car. It's a very clear explanation of why this could have unfair outcomes. The second answer tells us that some students may not get enough time to prepare themselves because they may also have to help their brothers and sisters get ready. The idea that some students may participate in looking after their siblings in ways that others don't, and for them, those that are giving the most to others, that they may find that they suffer because they haven't got enough time. It's a really lovely answer. We now move on to a different type of 4-mark answer. The challenge is greater in some question types than others, and this is one of the more challenging items on the test. This time there are 4 marks for the development of a single theme. It's not structured into 2 plus 2. The student needs to prepare a very detailed answer here, which is worthy of an award of 4 marks. Imagine you saw a friend behaving in a discriminatory way. Explain what you might say to help your friend understand why this is wrong. The mark scheme gives guidance that there's 1 mark for a creditable approach or idea, but then up to 3 marks for further development and explanation. There is some leeway in how we mark this. Perhaps we might mark this in terms of 2 plus 2, 2 developed things that are said, or it could be the development of 1 thing in a great deal of depth. There's different ways of getting the marks. If you look at the second paragraph in the mark scheme, it says, I would say what she had done was wrong. I'd ask her how she'd feel if treated like that. I would ask her to tell me why she was discriminating against the other person and suggest that if she treated her more kindly, she might get to know her better and like her. This shows a number of logical connections and developments spinning off the initial idea. We'll have a look at how students answered this in the exam now, noting that most students gained just 2 or 3 marks. It is important that students see there's 4 marks available and have an awareness that they do need to give us a series of statements that develop their ideas a good deal further. Read this, press pause, and then press play again when you're ready for me to show the real mark. Well, this gained 4 marks. It was felt there was sufficient here to merit that award, that the student continued to make connections from the initial idea and continue to develop their line of thinking. We're all humans. Judging people by their colour or age is wrong because that doesn't show who they truly are. The only way to know someone is after speaking to them. And what if that was you? How would you have felt? Exactly. You have to think before you speak. Let us be fair. We are all the same. Age, colour, religion does not give any of us superiority. We're all the same brothers and sisters. I think this is a very good example of the spirit of the Global Citizenship course showing through in a student's answer. Now have a read of this item, pause and press play when you're ready for me to show you what mark was awarded. This gained 2 marks. Although a considerable number of words have been written, it doesn't develop or connect a series of different ideas and statements. It does become a little repetitious or sticks to the same theme. I would personally call him to the side and explain to him that what he's doing is bad, because he's painting in people's minds that this is how a certain nationality, for example, acts, and however now everyone they see from that nationality, they'll assume that's how they will act. So for the sake of the people, stop doing it. What this is telling us is that we should tell somebody who has created a stereotype to stop doing that. We don't really see how the person that's being told would help to understand, for example, what it might feel like to be in that position. If you contrast this with the previous answer, this is a more limited approach to answering the question. We'll finish this section off with a quick review of key messages for students when they're attempting the 4-mark questions. There are 2 types of 2-mark questions. Some are broken down into a 2+2 tariff, whereas others ask for one thing to be explained in more depth, up to a maximum of 4 marks. It's vital they don't have knowledge gaps, which is a recurring theme of this presentation. If you've got a knowledge gap when you're attempting a 4-mark question, it could impact quite severely on your overall result. And always keep a glossary of key terms. This final part of the presentation, we turn our attention to the 6-mark question, which features at the end of every lower secondary global citizenship exam paper. It's a 6-mark question in which students are presented with a provocative statement and asked, how far do you agree with this? The idea here is to bring together different ideas they've studied as part of the course so that they can show a range of knowledge, but additionally to invite them to show that they can argue, discuss and evaluate a viewpoint, because these are important skills that are learned as part of the citizenship course and which they will develop further if they progress to the IGCSE course. This year's question asked them to discuss the statement, climate change has a worse impact on people's rights than it does on the environment. Do you agree? This allowed them to tell us a little something about people's rights, human rights, and something about the environmental impacts of climate change, and then to very briefly weigh up the 2 issues and tell us whether they agree or disagree. There were some excellent answers, but it has to be said that the most common mark awarded was 3 out of 6. Here's the mark scheme that was used. You'll see that it contains what's called indicative content, themes it was felt the students would be likely to write about. These would relate to the environment, the idea of rising sea levels, changing temperatures, potentially the migration of people to more habitable regions, and then ideas about human rights, about how climate change might affect some fundamental rights to life, health, food and shelter, that it might affect some vulnerable populations disproportionately, that there could be issues of social justice surrounding which countries are hurt most by climate change compared with the countries that have done the most to pollute the atmosphere. Now, unlike other questions on the paper, which are point marked, this is a level marked question in which teachers and examiners who are assessing student work need to take an overview of the student's answer as a whole and place it in one of three levels, level 1, 2, or 3. In each level there is a weighing up of different things we're asking the students to do. For example, if you look at level 2, there are 3 bullet points there. We're looking for some knowledge and understanding of both topics. We recognise in the mid-band it might be a little unbalanced. Perhaps they'll tell us more about rights than they will the climate. We're looking for some references to the landscape of the country where they live, perhaps. And we're also looking for a conclusion, even if it's a very brief one, saying, in conclusion, I agree or I disagree with the statement. So there is a formal practice here, asking students to debate and come to a conclusion. In the top band, for 5 to 6 marks, we'd expect to see balanced knowledge and understanding of both climate change and human rights, with a range of supporting evidence, and perhaps some plausible evidence from the student's own locality or country. The answer will have a clearer and perhaps substantiated conclusion. So these are level mark bands. These will always be the same from one session to the next, because they're linked with the assessment objectives for the test, which we looked at the start of this presentation. And they focus in on the knowledge and also the skills that we want students to develop as part of this course as they progress towards IGCSE and eventually A-level or diploma. Have a read through this first example now and decide which level you'd place it in, and perhaps even which mark. So read this now and press pause. Press play when you're ready for me to show you the mark that was awarded. This reached the top level. It was awarded 5 marks. This was one of the best responses seen in the summer exam. The student begins by saying that they broadly agree with the statement, because people will lose their right to live due to drought, prolonged hunger. Extreme heat could lead to famine, and people might lose a right to eat. Floods could deny people their right to shelter, an excellent point to have noted, leaving many displaced. They then move on to say that the floods, of course, are caused by the temperature increase. So we've moved on to the environment here. Plants, such as cactuses, have adapted to harsh conditions, is an idea that is perhaps not as relevant as it might be to the question, but we move on and we have a comment about how polar bears with thick fur withstanding cold temperatures could be in trouble if the temperature changes. Now there's an obvious weakness with this answer, which is that we don't have a conclusion. That is meant to be there. But a view was taken that, compared with many other candidates, this was quite a knowledgeable explanation of both the impact on rights and the impact on environment. So on balance, it was just allowed into the top level, despite there not being a formal conclusion. If there had been, this would undoubtedly have been awarded 6 marks. There is the levels. Knowledge and understanding of both topics in a balanced way, a range of evidence used, plausible evidence, but the last bullet point is not well supported. Some people might say you should keep that in level 2 as a result, but the counter-argument would be that if 2 of the bullet points have been done extremely well, then in the spirit of marking positively, we would place it at the bottom of the top band. Now pause, read this one and decide what level and perhaps which mark you'd give it. This was awarded 3 marks. It tells us that climate change will impact on the environment, because if the climate changes from cool to wet, then to drought, this could cause the death of plants and animals. So there's a clear explanation of environmental impacts, though it lacks any specific detail. The previous response mentioned polar bears and cactuses. This student continues, it also affects people's rights. If a certain area turns to drought, people may decide to move to a different place, leading people to treat them unequally. That's actually quite a sophisticated statement because it contains several logical connections in a chain of causal thinking. The idea that if the climate changes, there is a drought, and so people may have to move, And on arriving in a different place, they may find that they're not treated equally, with the clear inference there that their human rights are affected. It's that, more than anything, that lifts this into the middle band, because that is quite a sophisticated, if short, chain of reasoning that's been used there. On balance, looking at the levels, we do have knowledge and understanding of both topics. We don't have relevant examples other than in a very general term. But on balance, with the plausible references to what could happen to people, this just reaches the bottom of level 2. A summary for students of key things to remember when engaging with the 6-mark questions. Fundamentally, this is a synoptic question that will link together 2 topics, and we want them to tell us about both of those topics. In this example, it was human rights and the environment. It will be level-based and not point-based, which means that students need to be providing a balance of knowledge and also argument. Ideally, they will evaluate some of the ideas before arriving at a brief conclusion. They are advised always to present a 2-sided argument in order to answer the command, "How far do you agree?" The best advice would be that their final sentence or 2 would begin by saying, "In conclusion, I disagree," or "In conclusion, I agree with the statement because," and then to state their key argument. This brings us to the end of the presentation. There are several key messages that have recurred throughout this presentation. The first being that students need to read questions carefully. They need to focus on the key words. They must be guided by the number of marks, the number of lines that are provided, and be careful sometimes not to write too much as well. With some 2-mark and 4-mark questions, they need to keep an eye on the marks available and remember that with 1 mark available for a single accurate statement, another mark might be available for a development or explanation, which shows understanding. Multiple choice questions should never be left unanswered. If they don't know the correct answers, it's always worth guessing. There's no penalty for getting it wrong. The command words used in the questions are there for a reason. They're there to give a clue as to what type of answer is expected. The more familiar students are with this year's exam and the sample assessment materials, the better. And finally, read the 6-mark questions extra carefully because there is so many marks attached. Follow the question command as closely as you can. Thank you for listening. I hope that you and your students will have found this a useful and insightful presentation that will help prepare them for future exams.